Dear friends, we welcome Dr. Anita Bhandari, ma'am. Dr. Anita Bhandari, ma'am, she did her MS from Udaipur Medical College and she was working as assistant professor there at SMS Medical College. She then switched over specifically to neuro-otology field and she has got a fellowship in otology and neurotology from Singapore. And she has got a state-of-the-art vertigo and ear clinic in Jaipur and has got more than 500 super specialized vertigo and dizziness clinics in India, the whole Asia and Africa. She has innovated a few patents to her credit in the field of vertigo, basically in virtual reality for vestibular rehabilitation. She has got many publications and authored chapters in various neurology textbooks. She was also invited to our NES conference last year in March 2019 to deliver a prestigious NES oration. I am lucky enough to have a teacher like Dr. Anita Bhandari ma'am. She taught me during my residency also from 2005 till 2002 till 2005. Ma'am is totally devoted to neurotology. So I welcome you, ma'am, over here. You guys are gonna have a great day today because our fundamentals in pharmacotherapy are magnanimous. Thank you.
Yeah, Anita ma'am, you can share your screen and start off. Yeah.
Yeah, just. So thank you, Pawan, for the kind introduction. I'll just turn my cameras off. Right. So today we will be talking about the pharmacotherapy of vertigo and balance disorders. I often feel that this is a matchmaking in medicine. We interview the patient. We ask them details about their present history, their past history, even their family history. Then we go to do several tests to check out their performance. And finally, we match them with salts which seem to be compatible with their requirement. So today, let's talk about matchmaking and vertigo and how to make the right choice. The year 2020 has been a year like no other.
Hello.
Yeah. But I would like to remember it as the year of learning. Just today, I was up at 5:30 in the morning to listen to the brilliant talk by Professor Renato Cal of Brazil on BPPV. Over the last few weeks, we have been fortunate to listen to the most accomplished stalwarts from across the world, right from Dr. David Z, Dr. Daniel Gold, Professor Asprella, and the list goes on and on. Closer home, we have the academic treats from Dr. Anirban Sir, Dr. Srinivas, and all the other speakers who have really brought neurootology learning to the forefront. I would like to thank NES for bringing this platform to us with a special mention to the super dynamic Pawan Singer.
Hello.
Yeah. So I'd like to now start with a list of some of the common causes of vertigo and dizziness. I think some people are not muted. Could you just mute them, please, Dr. Suratwala? Right. So just the common causes of vertigo and dizziness is an inexhaustive list, but how many of these require drug therapy? So you can count them on your fingers. These are the major disorders which we will be talking about today and in which drug treatment is required. So if you see other diseases like BPPV with its 11 subtypes, no treatment, medical treatment is required. You will go for specific maneuvers. If it is peripheral vestibulopathy, we think of rehab. But when we think of these 5 diseases, here the role of drugs are there. The effect of drugs are through 2 ways. One is through the modulation of neurotransmitters, and secondly, by targeting the ionic channels. So, let me first start with the ion channels. So, when a depolarization wave reaches the presynaptic neuron, there is a fall in the voltage leading to an opening of the sodium channels. There is an influx of sodium, further depolarizing the cell and allowing the calcium channels to open. This allows the calcium ions to enter the neuron, and this facilitates the presynaptic vesicles to fuse with the surface membrane and release the neurotransmitter. The main neurotransmitters which are important for us are the 2 excitatory ones, acetylcholine and glutamate. Inhibitory neurotransmitter is GABA, along with some of the less important ones like histamine, dopamine, and 5-hydroxytryptamine, which are important to maintain the resting tone of the vestibular nucleus. So drugs which modify the action of neurotransmitters can do by way of an agonistic effect. That means it increases or potentiates the effect of these neurotransmitters, or antagonist, which actually compete with the neurotransmitter and effectively reduce their action. And the side effects of these drugs are by virtue of the effect of these neurotransmitters, which work all throughout the CNS. So I'd like to start with vestibular migraine, which is the commonest cause of recurrent spontaneous vertigo, amongst the commonest causes of vertigo across all age groups, and often an underdiagnosed condition. So the Berenice Society, the international classification for vestibular migraine, states vestibular migraine, they need to have at least one of the following 3 features. It can be headache, phonophobia and photophobia, or visual aura. So you can see that it is not necessary for headache to be part of the clinical picture. Further, when we talk about the vestibular symptoms, the vertigo can present as a spontaneous vertigo, or it can be an induced vertigo, induced by positional changes, visual or head motion induced vertigo. And when we talk about the symptoms, it was seen that although vertigo was a persistent feature, headache is present in only about 60% of the patients. So don't worry when you give a diagnosis of vestibular migraine and the headache is not present, that is totally acceptable and actually seen quite commonly. So vestibular migraine is a condition which can be mimicked by various other conditions, and it is only by a careful, detailed history, a clinical examination, and a neurological evaluation with which we can definitively rule out other disorders to rule in the correct diagnosis. So what this really means is that neuropathological tests do not have characteristic findings for migrainous vertigo, but other conditions which can be confused with the vestibular migraine definitely have definitive tests, and hence you can see that the main differential diagnosis which needs to be considered most importantly is BPPV, which also presents with positional vertigo, but is usually, when it is confused with vestibular migraine, it is usually the non-posterior BPPV. So you see the variants, or you see horizontal or anterior canal BPPV, which can be confused with vestibular migraine, and VNG guided positional test will show you very clearly the diagnosis. Bilateral peripheral vestibulopathy can also present with chronic unsteadiness, with fatigue. The patient feels it may also have psychosomatic symptoms because they are so, you can say, disturbed because of this constant unsteadiness, and which can mimic a migrainous picture as well. But doing the VHIT, dynamic visual acuity, caloric testing will give us a definitive diagnosis for which we need to then treat the patient. Vestibular paroxysmia can be diagnosed by VNG guided hyperventilation test, which can present as a vertical nystagmus, and MRI would point out the area of the neurovascular compromise. Meniere's disease we rule out with audiometry and VNG findings, which can help us differentiate an irritative lesion or a paretic lesion to make a better diagnosis. Arnold-Chiari malformation is not very common, but it presents with a history very, very similar to vestibular migraine. It presents with headaches, unsteadiness, and doing a VNG can unmask a spontaneous vertical nystagmus, usually downbeat nystagmus, which is accentuated on hyperventilation. And when we go for imaging in the form of an MRI of the brain and craniovertebral junction, the herniation of the brainstem becomes very clear. So these are the phases of migraine, and it is important for us to try to reduce the attacks from going into a full-blown picture. So vestibular migraine prophylaxis is indicated for patients who have recurrent episodes, usually more than 3 attacks in a month, and in which it is seriously disturbing their lifestyle and their normal functioning. These are the 4 categories of drugs which are normally used in prophylaxis. But how do we choose which one works best for our patient? So I'd like to describe these one by one for us to get a clearer idea there. You can see that the prophylactic treatment, different drugs act on different areas, and our treatment will be decided by all of these factors, right from the age, whether the male or female, weight, coexisting disorders, what drugs is that patient taking, but most importantly, what are the side effects of the drugs which you are going to give. That is the main deciding factor. So let me start with antidepressants, which is a very common category of drugs which is used for prophylaxis. The 3 main types of antidepressants, the tricyclic antidepressants, SSRIs, and the SNRIs are used. Now, when I come to the mode of action, you can see that there is the presynaptic nerve terminal releases serotonin into the cleft, the synaptic cleft, to stimulate the postsynaptic nerve. But there is also a reabsorption of these serotonin molecules back into the same presynaptic nerve. When we give an SSRI, this blocks this reabsorption, and hence more serotonin is available in the synapse. This improves the overall nerve transmission and leads to mood elevation. Also, SSRIs act by reducing inflammation at the microglia and the neutrophil. It improves the cerebral circulation, and it stimulates neurogenesis in the subependymal zone and dentate gyrus. So antidepressants are our first choice of treatment when the patient has disturbed sleep, depression, tension type headaches or neck pains. But it is contraindicated in patients with heart disease, glaucoma, and also should not be given in children. We now come to the next category of drugs, of which propranolol is the most used one. So the beta blockers have a trimodal effect on the migraine pathway. It turns off the migraine generator areas, especially the locus coeruleus. It blocks arterial dilatation and reduces the platelet hyperagglutination. Beta blockers are especially useful in patients who have anxiety, hypertension, and can be safely given in children. They should be avoided in patients who have bronchial asthma, heart disease or diabetes, depression, and hypertension. Things to remember is that it can cause impotence, so be careful when giving to young males. The pulse should not go below 60, and you should give instructions to the patient to keep measuring their pulse maybe every few days. And if it goes below 60, we would need to stop the medicine. But never stop beta blockers suddenly, because sudden stoppage can lead to chest pain, angina, and even a heart attack. The third category, the calcium channel blockers, of which most commonly used drug is flunarizine. So how does calcium work within the body at different sites? In the vestibular cells, it works by increasing the neurotransmitter release to increase the nerve firing. On the smooth muscles of the vessels, it increases the vasoconstriction, which leads to a decrease in the microcirculation. And on the RBCs, it decreases the rheological factor, the flexibility, and hence leads to increased viscosity. So when we give a calcium channel blocker, you can see the following effects. So as the neurotransmitter release is inhibited, there will be less nerve firing. There will be improvement of the microcirculation, and the viscosity of blood will reduce. So calcium channel blockers are one of our first line prophylactic drugs when patients have severe recurrent vertigo, and also it is a useful drug in children. But it cannot be used in patients who have depression, Parkinson's, heart disease, or low systolic BP. One of the side effects which we need to be careful about is weight gain. And the last class of drugs I'd like to talk about are the membrane stabilizers. These drugs are especially important because we, as ENT surgeons, most of us are ENT surgeons on the group, are not so familiar with these drugs and are sometimes even scared to use them because we are not really trained in this. But I'd like to assure you that these drugs are used extensively all across the world, are very safe, and are they are very effective. So I'll talk about topiramate and divalproic sodium. So the membrane stabilizers basically work as sodium and potassium and calcium channel blockers. So coming back to the diagram which I showed you at the beginning, these two drugs inhibit the calcium and the sodium channels, and so do not allow the ionic influx into the nerves, Hence, there is less depolarization and the nerves are stabilized. Topiramate is a preferred drug for overweight patients, patients who have a long, prolonged history of migraine, and it is one of the very effective drugs in medication overuse headaches. It should not be given in patients who have depression, kidney stones, or glaucoma. We need to be very careful and explain to the patient that if they have memory lapses or loss of concentration and or eye pain, we need to immediately stop the drug. When we talk about divalproex, again very effective in severe and prolonged migraine, and it is better to give it in the non-obese patients. It should be avoided in reproductive age females because it can cause PCOD, hormonal fluctuations, hyperhirsutism, things like that. Just a small mention of supplements which have been talked about in migraine treatment. So it has been said that deficiency of vitamin B6, B12, folic acid can increase the homocysteine level and activate migraine in these various ways. But more important in the supplements is magnesium. Magnesium deficiency is said to play an important role in the pathogenesis of migraine headaches by promoting cortical spreading depression, altering the neurotransmitter release, and working on platelet hyperaggregation. But by giving a supplement, we can decrease all of these. And it has been even published that vestibular migraines and menstrual migraines respond extremely well to magnesium when given in long, it has to be given as a long dose in a longer duration, not as an acute treatment. So the American Migraine Foundation suggests that a 400 to 500 mg daily supplement helps in reducing the migraine attacks. Just like to mention one of the newer drugs, CGRP receptor blockers. These are monoclonal antibodies which act on one of the transmitters, CGRP, which is responsible for causing vasoconstriction. So these blockers inhibit the vasodilatation so that it reduces the pain and the migrainous symptoms of photophobia, phonophobia, etc. However, this new drug is useful only for headaches and not for vertigo. It is very expensive and needs to be given as monthly injections. And a mention of Botox, which is also useful in recurrent severe attacks, more than 15 per month. These are the various areas where the Botox injection needs to be given. It has a life of about 3 months, so needs to be repeated every 3 monthly. And again, effective only for headaches, not so much for the vertigo. So important points to remember when you go for a prophylaxis is that start with a low dose and gradually increase. Starting with high doses will reduce the compliance of the patient by virtue of side effects. The patient is not ready to take these medicines. We have to impress upon the patient that it will take 4 to 6 weeks for the drug to attain its optimum efficacy. So do not expect instant relief, and we need to continue the prophylaxis for at least 3 months or longer. So remember, this is not a short-term treatment. I'd also like to talk about medication overuse headache or chronic daily headaches. Patients who have headaches which are more than 15 per month will not respond to prophylaxis if detoxification is not done. So that means we have to bring down their intake of the painkillers, of the abortive therapy, and detoxify them, explaining what we're doing before starting the prophylaxis, and then only it will be effective. The next disease I'd like to talk about is Meniere's disease. So, Meniere's disease, our treatment is basically aimed at aborting an acute attack and preventing future attacks. Now, a lot of literature has come out to explain how the pathophysiology of Meniere's and migraine is so similar, and they may actually be part of a spectrum with Meniere's disease at one end and vestibular migraine at the other. So there is an intimate relation between both of these, and Professor Timothy Hayne has said that Meniere's and migraine may actually be two faces of the same indistinguishable condition. He goes on to say that in his busy practice, almost 1/4 of his patients who were diagnosed with Meniere's also carried the diagnosis of migraine in almost 1/4 of patients. So we need to treat both of them. So when we go for a Meniere's management, we need to rethink our strategies. So besides giving diuretics, migraine prophylaxis in these patients will actually be extremely helpful. And I've seen that in my own practice, in which Meniere's patients being treated with migraine prophylactic drugs have shown extremely good results. In patients who do not respond adequately to the drug treatment, we may have to think of intratympanic drug delivery in the form of steroids in patients where there is not so much of hearing loss, but the vertigo is intractable. The effect of this is through anti-inflammatory effect of the glucocorticoid and modification of the iron transport mechanism. But patients with intractable vertigo, with unserviceable hearing, may also be taken for intratympanic gentamicin, which will help in reducing the endolymph production by the dark cells. So when we give an injection, the gentamicin goes from the perilymph to the endolymph via the round window. It causes damage to the mitochondria of the vestibular cells, and the dark cells show a reduced production of endolymph. So in effect, we are actually converting an unstable labyrinth into a stable, non-functioning labyrinth. And this becomes much more amenable to treatment with rehab. The patient recovers in a much better way and is not always scared of getting these sudden attacks which incapacitate them. So gentamicin given in the posterior inferior quadrant combined with soda bicarb. In the follow-up, we need to repeat audiometry, check for any spontaneous nystagmus. If spontaneous nystagmus is still seen, that is showing that there has not been an effective knocking out of the labyrinth. So not really knocking out, but reducing function. And with the VHIT, we will be able to confirm that the peripheral dysfunction has set in. Steroids are useful in two conditions: vestibular neuritis, but only within the first 5 days of onset. It has no role to play after the first 5 days. And autoimmune inner ear disease respond quite well to the steroids, but it has to be given for a long treatment with a maintenance dose finally reaching 10 milligrams per day. You must have seen that I haven't really talked about doses and side effects, because that you can get uh, easily, whether you Google it or you look it up in books. My aim in the talk is basically to introduce the concept of why we are giving these drugs so that we can choose the correct molecules. And hence, so the next topic will now be management of acute vertigo. The first thing you need to differentiate when a patient comes with acute vertigo is whether it is peripheral or central. Do not start your treatment before ascertaining this, because we don't want to step into a disaster in which we've tried to suppress the symptoms and missed some sinister underlying pathology. So after a careful clinical examination, I'm going back to those same neurotransmitters which we have talked about, and I'd like to talk about how different drugs work on these neurotransmitters. So if I talk about glutamate, when the efferent nerve fibers are stimulated, there is a glutamate release at the presynaptic nerve into the synapse. And this results in vestibular cell activation. On the other hand, the brainstem works on the efferent neurons, releases acetylcholine, which will actually modify and control the efferent nerve. So you can see that acetylcholine controls the activation of the presynaptic neuron, and then once the presynaptic neuron is activated, glutamate will further activate the vestibular cells. So there is sort of a feedback, a loop which to control everything. Let's talk about acetylcholine and the cholinereceptors. So cholinereceptors can be of two types, the muscarinic and the nicotinic. Muscarinic are especially important for our vertigo symptoms. H1 receptors are very similar in structure to these muscarinic receptors, and hence all H1 receptor antagonists have their anti-vertigo effect by virtue of their anticholinergic action. But there are certain side effects. Dryness of mouth and sedation are extremely common. Also, we must remember that anticholinergics must be given before the onset of symptoms to work. So this is a very complex web, and I've just made it to show you how different drugs act on multiple sites. So if I talk about flunarizine, you'll see that not only is it a calcium channel blocker, it also works on acetylcholine, histamine, dopamine. So you have multiple sites of action. Or meclizine, which is both an antihistaminic and a cholinergic action. We talk about benzodiazepines, which modify the GABA drugs. So when we are asked about can we give drug combinations, I'd like to say it's better to avoid them, because the multiple actions of all the drugs can cause a change in the neurotransmitter equilibrium, which is a very, very delicate balance. And you can see that if we were to increase the glutamate activity, you would get anxiety, night awakenings. But GABA is a controlling neurotransmitter as when vis-a-vis the glutamate. GABA in the optimum doses in the body has a calming effect. It helps in the processing, the thought and the cognitive processing. But if the GABA uh, quantities go too high, it will cause the patient to get sedated. We don't want to do that. So it's important to be able to achieve an equilibrium. So when we give acute drugs during acute vertigo, our aim behind it is to decrease the acute symptoms, the spinning, the vomiting, allay the anxiety, but we have to stop these as soon as possible and never give them for more than 5 days, because they will otherwise have other effects all across the nervous system. So we saw some of the dopaminergic drugs like prochlorperazine, like meclizine. So these drugs are balanced again acetylcholine. So when the dopamine levels fall, acetylcholine levels go up. If we were to give increased doses of dopaminergic drugs, the acetylcholine will go even higher and you can get extrapyramidal syndrome. So we need to be aware of these kinds of syndromes which can happen when we tip this neurotransmitter equilibrium status. A word about the histamine receptors. So there are the 4 histamine receptors. Beta histine is known to act on all 4 of them. And for the H1 and H2 receptors, it acts as a weak agonist, while it is an antagonist on the H3 and H4 receptors. The strongest action is on H3. And the H3 is actually an autoreceptor. That means it also controls the action on the H1 and H2. H4 effect is actually not considered to be very important. It may cause suppression of the vestibular neuron firing and vestibular nucleus firing. So I'd like to go back to the H3 effect. So the H3 effect is the most important. The H3 receptor is responsible for reducing histamine release in the body. When beta histine acts on it and antagonizes its effect, it causes an increased release of histamine. And this is probably the reason why the company claims that beta histine is associated with wakefulness. There has been a lot of literature on beta histine. But much of this literature is biased, uncontrolled, and we really do not know where it stands, because we have one group talking about the extreme efficacy in various situations at very, very high doses. And on the other hand, you have the Cochrane reviews talking about beta histine being a placebo. So I think we really need a lot more controlled, well-documented studies for us to really know what beta histine stands for and what is its role in vertigo drugs. A question which we are often asked is, does giving an antagonist and an agonist drug together make sense? So when we talk about in relation to the histamines, the antihistaminic drugs, the H1 receptor antagonist, basically drugs like dimenhydrinate, like meclizine, they do not have their anti-vertigo action by virtue of their effect on the H1 receptors. It is the anticholinergic effect which is responsible for the anti-vertigo action. And when I talk about beta histine, it has a very weak H1 agonist action. The main action is on the H3 receptor. So you would see from this is that both of these category of drugs have actually very little effect on H1 receptors, and hence actually doesn't really make sense giving them together. They do not have their effect on the H1. Before I close my talk, I would like to talk to this audience, this August audience, about something which has really bothered me. And I would like to propose this. Perhaps we can take it to a higher level, that the doctor's prescription should be viewed as a contract. The clinician gives a prescription for a certain duration, gives certain drugs in certain doses which are correct. The dosage, the duration, everything is according to the medical guidelines. But we often see that patients use the same prescription repeatedly. Just today morning, I saw a patient who I had given 6 months ago Divalproex for 6 weeks, and that patient has been taking it for 6 months. Now, chemists are giving these medicines without medical advice. It is compromising the patient's safety. And what action can we take as doctors as to take this to a next level of ethical practice? I will ask you questions about how we can safeguard the interest of the patient by making a doctor's prescription a contract. So I'd just like to end that you will never find the right, I cut the person and put medicine here. You will never find the right medicine if you never let go of the wrong one. So thank you so much. Choose the right drug and you will have a happy patient. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Dr. Narendra Suratwala. Sir, where are you? Okay, I've unmuted you.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. We can hear you. Srinivas. Where is Srinivas?
The Srinivas and other panelists are online.
Yeah. Vivek.
Hello, sir. I am unmuted. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Anita, it was a fantastic overview you have given, and you have really cleared the basics and the pharmacology and the cytotoxin particularly.
And
I like
Dr.
it.
Amit.
Usually, whenever I attend the pharmacotherapy, people do not talk in detail about the site of the action, and that part you have covered very nicely. Now, we are going to the panelists. But before we go to the panelists, my personal question to Anita, which is the ultra short acting drug? Do you hear me, Anita?
Yeah, I can hear you.
What is your preference of short acting drug which doesn't produce a masking on the nystagmus finding?
So all of the anti-vertigo drugs will reduce in the short term, will reduce the nystagmus because that is their action. They are decreasing the asymmetry at the vestibular nucleus level. And hence, so whether you talk about prochlorperazine, you talk about meclizine, you talk about cinnarizine, they all will reduce it. But still, by removing optic fixation, you can still generally detect the nystagmus.
Now, what happens in our private practice or in any neurototal practice, the patient, supposingly, for example, DPP comes and he has got nausea or vomiting, so which is just not controlled by the metoclopramide or whatsoever, then we need to give some vestibular sedative. So normally we advise to stop all vestibular sedative 48 hours in advance, which can produce the masking. Okay. Hello.
Yes, sir.
But then some of the patients.
So I would just like to share with you, sir, that definitely these drugs will have an effect on the calorics, but they will not have any effect on your BPPV. So because the torsional effect, the nystagmus of BPPV is too strong to be suppressed with these anti-vertigo drugs. And in fact, you might have noticed that patients, we always see everyday patient comes to us on anti-vertigo drugs and we can still easily diagnose BPPV on the positional test. So there is no need to stop. in private practice, sir, I totally agree with you. So what I do, I am also in private practice. So I take the patient at the first instance for testing, because for me, the most important things at that instance is to be able to differentiate peripheral from central. And this will not be compromised with any drug. I can still do it. Secondly, I can do my BPPB evaluation. There are a few tests which I would postpone till the next day, stopping the drugs, but these tests can easily be done the first day. So you can actually tell the patient that I'm going to do these tests today, and you need to stop the medicine, and we'll do the next, maybe evening or by the next day.
Okay, that's nice, very nice opinion from your private practice and the individual conclusion. Now, my second question is about what is your drug of choice in epileptic vertigo?
Right. So again, a very, very rare condition, but
Yes.
if it is epilepsy, normally I would not treat it. I would refer to the neurologist, because I
Yeah.
don't think I am trained well enough to treat epilepsy. It is not a simple condition, and a lot of things will need to be considered. So I would really not treat it. Perhaps we have some neurologist on our panel who can shed more light on it.
Yeah, that's a take-home message for everyone who is going to diagnose this rare condition. Now, there's a question from our elected President Mohan. How common is the depression, a coexisting factor in the recurrent vertigo?
Right. So I would say that depression is actually a very, very common thing, because the patients feel lost. They lose their confidence. They're not sure what is happening with them. So anxiety and depression are common comorbidities of various types of vertigo and balance disorders. So, what we actually like to tell the patient is that your depression, your anxiety also has a lot of bearing of the fear of the unknown. If we can diagnose what you have, you are clear about what is happening with your body. That is when we can take control, and the patient actually becomes much more confident. Still, some patients, especially vestibular migraine patients, often have coexisting depression, and in that we like to add drugs, drugs like amitriptyline, which are very, very useful in these patients.
Yes. Now, this question goes to Srinivas. How long can we give topiramate?
Sir, I
Srinivas?
personally don't use topiramate much, so that is not something that I can really comment.
Anita, can you comment, Anita, on that?
Uh, so I like to share, so that I use topiramate quite commonly. We started with 25 milligrams OD dose in the first week,
Yes.
and then in the second week we make it BD. Normally, in our Indian patients, I've seen that we can get away with this low dose drug. Normally, neurologists increase it by 25 milligrams every week for the next 6 weeks. But I have had very good results with 50 mg.
I would like to add something here. We have used this topiramate in patients with starting with 25 and then raising to 50 and then up to 100 per week, and then taking it for around 4 to 6 months, and it has given good results.
Amit, you are the right person to vouch upon the opinion of Anita. Now, there's one more question to Amit, to you from Dr. Soini. She's asking, what are the doses of sodium valproate to be used?
So valproate we give about 500 mg for around 3 months. For 3 months we have tried giving this valproate 500 mg for 3 months.
Okay. Vivek is there? Vivek Mithil?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, Hello, sir. Can you
He's
hear me?
asking how to decide for the prophylaxis to be started in case of Meniere's disease, and what is your preference of prophylaxis?
You just unmute me. Yeah. Okay.
Hey, we are not getting your voice here.
Yes. Vivek Matthew, you want me to answer the previous question?
Yeah, you can answer both the questions.
Yeah, so I am a neurologist, and with regard to topiramate and divalproate, to begin with, I'm highly impressed with Dr. Anita's speech. What she's talked about very slowly, clearly, she has listed out all the conditions. That's very important. Pharmacology, the neurotransmitters, it needs to be highlighted very much that they all have multiple actions. So this is something that we deal with as neurologists. We try and dissect out and try and give as specific a neurotransmitter as possible. But in particularly in neurootology, we tend to use medications which have multiple actions. So we really need to know that each medicine has got multiple actions. Second is when we relook at the actual evidence in favor of cinnarizine and beta-histine, that's also extremely important, and keep that in mind as against the other neurotransmitters. The red boxes on the right that she gave are the most important thing for each medication. And regarding topiramate and divalproate in specific, I agree completely. We would start with topiramate at around 25 milligrams. And yes, very much so that many patients will have adequate relief at just 25 milligrams twice daily. We do not need to increase everybody to 50 milligrams twice daily. Topiramate is used by us in as high doses as 200 milligrams twice daily in patients with seizures, with epilepsy. We rarely ever need to go beyond 100 milligrams per day, that is 50 milligrams PD for patients with vestibular migraine, or with patients who have got when we are treating migraine as a whole. Divalproate is the medicine that we use rather than valproate, and divalproate we would start with 250 or even as low as 125 and gradually increase. Again, we rarely need to go beyond 250 for divalproate. So, and if you're suspecting an epilepsy of vertiginous seizures specifically, this is a very specific form of temporal lobe epilepsy which needs to be looked at very closely. This is a diagnosis that requires very specific investigations and most often require a video EEG to be able to prove that. So that would require a generally referral to an epilepsy center. But otherwise, I'm grateful for this excellent talk, and thank you so much for bringing up these points. If there's anything else from the neurology side, I would be glad to comment. Meniere's disease is not something that I treat.
Yeah, we are happy. We are happy to have you in the webinar. We are really happy, and thank you for your presence. Now, Srinivas, there's one question. Can HIT be used in an acute episode of vertigo? Srinivas?
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
There is a question to you.
Yes, sir.
Can the test HIT be used in acute episode of vertigo?
Sir, in fact, it was designed for acute episode only, sir.
So
in fact, the first head impulse test, when it became available for as part of the HINTS protocol, okay. So HINTS protocol is head impulse, nystagmus, and test of skew. So it was meant to be used during the first attack of acute vertigo. But then if you know the person, so to rule out or rule in the presence of a stroke. But then if you are having a person who you know of Meniere's or you know of vertiginous migraine and is coming with multiple episodes, probably you may consider not doing it during the acute episode. But head impulse as part of the HINTS protocol was designed for the to be done in an acute patient. But the problem in doing it in an acute patient is the interpretation. It is not that easy. It is not as easy as the publication. It is not as easy as giving a speech to actually in the emergency interpret a head impulse in an acutely vertiginous patient with ongoing nystagmus. It is quite difficult, and I agree that I find it difficult sometimes to interpret in an acutely vertiginous patient with an ongoing nystagmus. So whoever has asked that is probably somebody who is really very experienced, who sees patients in the emergency. That is why he's asked the question. But may I know who asked that question, sir?
It's not mentioned in the questionnaire.
Yeah, but whatever it is, it's a beautiful question because it's asked by a person
I
who is
think it's
actually
by Arnab Biswas, sir.
seeing
Arnab
emergency.
Biswas, sir.
Sir?
Arnab Biswas, sir.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Suratwala
Okay,
sir.
there's one more question, Srinivas, to you.
Yes, sir.
Srinivas, sir. I have a
This
question.
is from the omnipresent Prakash Munka.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
I find him everywhere, and he's quite academic and quite enthusiastic to ask the question.
Yes.
He's asking that what are the combination which can be used rationally to control the vertigo?
Sir, actually,
Can you give some examples?
sir, when it comes to, of course, rational, irrational, all those things, I am not going to get into. We don't know enough to tell what is rational, what is irrational at the present state of knowledge. All that I can appeal is that people should have an open mind. One combination, cinnarizine plus dimenhydrinate, lot of people know that it is clinically beneficial, and as my teacher, my brother Dr. Avinash Bijlani tells, he uses a beautiful point. He tells the difference between medicine and poison is in the dosage. So sometimes it so happens that you can use a combination to your advantage by individually reducing the dose of each of these drugs and then using a combination. One really tried and trusted combination is cinnarizine with dimenhydrinate, which has been there. I also know of people, see, there is one raging debate. The moment somebody asks this question, you are talking about whether you can combine cinnarizine and beta histine is the thing. And there are, it is half.
That I will come to. That I will come to that point after.
And then there are again combinations of diuretics. Unfit. When you give diuretics again, there is a possibility of adding a potassium sparing diuretic to add, so that you really don't have the side effects of one diuretic. So these kind of things are there. So every combination need not be bad. Some combinations can actually be good. Okay, as to quote Dr. Bijlani again, by reducing the dose of individual drugs and combining them to enhance the action.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Vivek, there's a question for you. I have seen personally a lot of my friends, neurophysicians in my town, they are studying combination of beta histine and cinnarizine. What is your comment? How frequently you use this combination at your clinic or at your institute? Vivek?
Dr. Matthew?
Vivek? Okay, Amit, can you hear this?
Yes, sir.
Amit?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you take up this question?
Sir, we have tried giving beta-histidine plus cinnarizine for Meniere's disease, and we have gotten some good results. Like we had a trial where we give the beta-histidine 48 mg per day in combination with cinnarizine 40 mg for 4 weeks, then tapering it to 20 mg for 2 weeks, and then 20 mg per alternate day on for 2 weeks, and this total combination for 6 months, and it was beneficial.
Okay. On what parameters you judge the response?
Sir?
On what parameters you judge the response of this combination? On what parameters?
The patients were compliant. The patients were compliant. They had reduced episodes of vertigo, and their audiometry was not going down in these patients which we given.
No, the basic understanding in Meniere is that we have got the initial stage of fluctuating loss. Then afterwards it is a down sloping loss, mostly affecting the higher frequencies, about 3000 hertz or so. So that's not a criteria, because Meniere's disease is not a reversible one. See, as far as the hearing is concerned. Once you lose the hearing, that is gone forever.
Sharp downhill after these drugs.
That is okay, but then how long you give this combination?
6 months, sir.
If you want to prevent the deafness for 6 months, okay.
Suratwala,
do you have a long-term study on this, I suppose?
Sir,
Pawan?
हाँ sir, Pawan बोल रहा हूँ. Sir, I have seen two patients.
You want to say something?
Yeah, sir. Sir, among my this thing, Meniere's disease patients, I have seen two patients in which even hearing improved. Whether I think Srinivas would have seen maybe a couple of cases, such cases. I have seen two cases among maybe a few dozens of cases in which it improved with the use of Diamox, acetazolamide. I used it for maybe a month to couple of cases. Then in two cases only, I saw some improvement in hearing, audiometric improvement in hearing.
Those cases not be the fluctuating hearing loss. Those are initial stages. Initial stages I can increase, but usually what I have seen last 30 or 40 years, the hearing doesn't improve more than 10 dB because in hundreds of sag decompression which are seen, the hearing doesn't improve more than 10 dB. Okay, and probably the mixed component becomes reduced, but not necessarily the bone conduction level.
Dr. Srinivas will say something.
I'd like to add.
Yes, sir. Some patients do improve. Some patients do improve.
Yeah. Anita, ma'am?
But
Yeah,
what stage, Srinivas?
Right.
In what stage of mania?
Sir, see, the overall number of people, see, we are not that good documenters. Definitely, I'm not as good as a documenter as you, sir. But then, as Dr. Pawan says, anecdotally, yes. But then probably we need to do a little more detailed with a more number of patients to see how many people. But if you ask me whether I have seen improvement in threshold in some patients, yes.
Anita wanted to say something.
Yeah, sir, I'd like to definitely.
Anita, let the question be taken by Anita, please.
Right, sir. Sir, I'd like to say that I can definitively say that I have seen several patients who improve with treatment of Meniere's disease. Most of them are with a fluctuant hearing loss. So that is showing that the permanent loss has not yet set in. It is still a fluctuating. That means it is improving and going down. And we have been able to achieve even near normal or mild hearing losses from moderate and moderately severe. So definitely it is possible to increase this. And sometimes it stays in the, if the higher frequencies are involved, they are less likely to come back to normal, but lower frequencies are much better responsive to treatment.
Correct. My teachers, they used to give oral prednisolone for fluctuating loss, and they have seen good results in the hearing, but certainly not more than 10 dB. That was, I am talking somewhere about 40 years back story. And still in the stage 1, if you believe in staging by Shears, then in stage 1, oral prednisolone or dexamethasone, that does work. To not only to control the vertigo, but also to improve the hearing as well as to get away from the heaviness in the ear. Now, Vivek, are you online now?
Yes, sir, I am.
Vivek?
Please, can you, sir? Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Okay. There's a question for you. That how you, this is not a pharmacological question, but is somebody is asking that how do you diagnose the epileptic vertigo?
Sure, sir. So there are, first is how do we suspect it, and second is how do we confirm it. So suspicion will be for very brief episodes, and usually since these are also temporal lobe epilepsies, there may be a component of a behavioral arrest. So if the patient is stops doing whatever they're doing along with the symptom, they may have. So this symptom is basically an aura of the seizure. So they have the symptom.
Yes.
Along with that, they may stop doing whatever they're doing. So if they have a very brief seizure with this kind of a manifestation, then this would be an indication for trying to capture it on a video EEG. So what we do is we do an EEG while simultaneously trying to do a video, and if we can capture an event and we see an EEG correlate for the event that we are seeing on the video, then we know for certain that it is a vertiginous seizure. Generally, it will follow the same principles of seizures over a period of time. Often, some of them may have lesions, some of them may not have lesions on MRI. And finally, if you are not able to capture it on a video EEG, we may at times go with a anti-epileptic drug trial, in which case any of the medications which we would use according to the adverse effect profile for that particular patient, we would give for about a month and try and track what is the kind of response that they're having. But ideally, in every situation, we would try and capture an episode on a video EEG. Just getting an EEG alone, a scalp EEG alone, is not adequate, because an EEG is even in a few 1 to 3% of normal individuals also can show some non-specific changes which can get reported as abnormal. So an abnormal scalp routine EEG does not imply that the patient has a vertiginous seizure. The best way and the confirmatory way is to capture it on a video EEG, and we capture the ictus on a video EEG rather than what we call as interictal non-specific changes, which can be seen even in migraine as well. I hope that answers the question.
But do you think that we should have two EEG? One is in silent phase and one is during attack?
Yes, sir. So the routine EEG, which is done for about 20 to 30 minutes during between episodes, that is not very specific for labeling somebody as vertiginous seizures. It would be a combination of multiple factors, and the ideal method is actually a video EEG, during which we capture the event as well as the ictal EEG, what we call as the ictal EEG, during which we will see this, some specific changes, usually locating it to the temporal lobe is the most common origin for these vertiginous seizures.
Okay, next question. Anita, you are there? Anita?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There's a question from Pune, from Dr. Simab Sheikh. He's asking, how do I decide when to start prophylaxis? Probably he's referring to migraine, I suppose.
Sir, I lost the. Sir, could you repeat the question, please?
There's a question from Sima from Pune.
Yes.
He's asking, how do I decide when to start the prophylaxis on OPD basis?
So yes, a very good question. So prophylaxis is indicated when abortive therapy, that means the treatment to stop episodes in the form of anti-vertigo drugs for the episode, acute episode, or headaches as abortive therapy with anti-inflammatories or the triptans are more than 3 per month. Secondly, it can be due to when these episodes interfere with the quality of life and hamper their normal activities. That is when we have to think of prophylaxis. And when you do take it, you do start prophylaxis, we need to decide which category of drugs will be most effective in this category of patient which you have to address. And secondly, at what dosage. So dosage also will be decided by various factors.
I suppose the asker has got a correct answer for that. Now there is one more question to you, Anita. What is your preference in using, again it is regarding the prophylaxis for Meniere's disease. What is your drug of choice or combination of drugs as a prophylaxis used in case of Meniere's disease?
So along with diuretics, if again the episodes of vertigo in the Meniere's disease, they need to be frequent enough for us to start prophylaxis. If a patient has an episode once in 3 months or 6 months, then you just need to address the acute episodes. No regular treatment would be required, although it would be a good idea to go for salt restriction, caffeine restriction, or any triggers which the patient has been able to identify. But if these episodes again become more frequent, it affects the hearing, then we need to be more aggressive in our treatment. I usually go for drugs like acetazolamide, actually not in very high doses, starting with 250 mg once a day, and then going on to make it in the next 10 days go to half a tablet. I go for migraine prophylactic drugs in these patients in whichever category. Again, from those 4 categories, I choose the appropriate drug and give this for maybe the next 6 weeks. Beta histine, I usually use it when I choose to take beta histine in the prescription. It will be usually 48 milligrams twice a day or 48 milligrams once a day. But I do not go for low dosage of beta histine. But most prescriptions are basically diuretics along with migraine prophylaxis.
Okay. Srinivas, you want to say something on this, on the same question?
Yep. Regarding the when to treat or the dosage, sir. Hello.
No, regarding the prophylactic medicines in case of Meniere's disease.
Sir, in case of Meniere's disease, I do give, and my first choice medicine is beta histine.
Yes.
Beta histine, and it is 16 mg.
Though it is banned in, though it is not improved in US.
It is not there in USA, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So what you will get if you are practicing in US?
If I am practicing in USA, it's a difficult question. Luckily, I am in India, and
No, it's possible nowadays with telemedicine you can prescribe. Overseas.
Yes, sir. I think you are suggesting something. Maybe you can only tell, sir, which will be your choice.
Diuretics for migraine prophylaxis, for Meniere's prophylaxis.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, I have never prescribed beta histine in last 30 years or so. I know this drug since 1970 it was introduced or so, and it has disappeared from the market for 15 years and again rise and again came up. But I don't use beta histine for prophylactic. I use diuretics, usually acetazolamide, as Anita said.
So
It is
Acetazolamide is
sufficient to
a beautiful
control.
drug, sir. It's a beautiful drug.
Beg your pardon?
Acetazolamide works well.
So that is
I
usually
would like
sufficient
to
to
ask
control.
something. Sir, in the prophylaxis of Meniere's, do we ask the patient to do a mild salt reduction or a radical salt reduction in its diet? Like I heard someone who said that the daily dose of salt should be less than 1.5 grams in such patients if we are trying to give him a Meniere's prophylaxis.
It is again, Amit, this is a debatable point. The microscope doesn't believe in sodium restriction. Okay. And I believe it all depends on person to person, the sodium intake and output and those things. So if you are giving a diuretics, then there is no need to put the patient on salt restriction. It has to be mild. It should not be very much, the patient should not be losing much of the potassium. So you select the diuretic accordingly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now we come to another question. This has been also already answered by Anita, the roses of betadine. There's a question to Srinivas. What about the beta histine plus selagelin combination?
Actually,
Hello?
I have not used it in anybody, but then by going by pharmacological thinking, that I think it is going to be a very beautiful combination. I am not yet aware of a combination of that presently being available in India. If somebody has seen that, please let me know, because I am also waiting for it. But going by the
Anita, can you expand the answer?
Sir? Hello?
Sir?
Anita?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Anita, can you expand the answer? Whatever the Srinivas has said so far.
So this combination has been proposed by Professor Michael Stroop. He has been advocating high doses, very, very high doses of beta histine, because literature does say that the dose of beta histine is actually dose dependent. The higher dose you give, the better is the action. But sometimes if it go, what he has been explaining about these huge doses, he has proposed the idea of giving selegiline, which is a MAO inhibitor, to decrease the dose. So when it is combined with beta histine plus selegiline, it may help us reduce the dosage required to make beta histine more effective without increasing the dose to very high levels. Selegiline, I believe, is not yet available in India. I haven't really encountered it. I'm not sure. Perhaps the neurologist on the panel can shed more light. But I am still looking to see the effect of this drug. So, because I'm not so aware of the pharmacokinetics of selegiline, I would like to maybe read more about it before really propagating it. But if it can reduce the required dose, I'm sure it can help using beta histine more effectively.
So, Amit, there is a question for you. How do you taper the vestibular sedative dose? Is there any particular scheme or a policy or protocol for that?
So we taper the dose in last 1 month of the treatment. Hello?
Last, like, can you repeat?
Sir, what was the question?
How do you taper the doses of vestibular sedative?
We haven't really tapered the dose, sir. Actually, we always, when the patient comes to us in the last few visits, then we see the response and then we, I mean, maybe it's right or wrong, but we stop that dose. Okay, like you want okay now, then you can go.
No, usually in peripheral disorders, we don't advise the vestibular sedatives for more than 3 to 4 days.
Yes, sir.
So it's the control points where you require to give these medicines for a longer time. The question is related to that, I suppose.
Maybe, so we haven't given vestibular sedatives for a long time. We always ask for the patient to get diagnosed, and we don't usually prescribe vestibular sedatives for a long time.
And what?
Hello?
Hello?
Dr. Vivek, you can take some questions there from the chat box itself. Or Dr. Srinivas.
Sir.
You can take some questions from the chat box.
Most of the questions are being answered there only.
Yeah, can you please explain which hearing, will hearing improve with drugs in Meniere's? Again, the same question. I think, Dr. Srinivas, we have to do a multi-center study on that.
Yeah.
Because I've seen in 2 patients, I've seen a good improvement in hearing.
Yeah.
And I think Amit Kesri,
the best answer will be from a RCT.
Yeah, Amit Kesri would also admit, because he has seen this in his patients also.
Exactly.
And
I think Dr. Mansa wants to know the explanation how it improves. So that maybe it may be just a matter of speculation. First and foremost is to, through a multi-center study, to establish that yes, it happens. It is not just anecdotal. It is not just what Srinivas, Dr. Pawan and Dr. Amit has seen, that everybody is seeing that. After that, we can always spend time in trying to find out how exactly it happens.
And you do have a very good question by Dr. Seemab Sheikh, that how do you decide about Meniere's prophylaxis among all 3 groups of drugs? Which one is your drug of choice for prophylaxis?
See, my drug of choice, for the one reason why I choose beta histine, is The only reason probably is that one is it works in a lot of people. Okay. Irrespective of what so many studies this way, that way, all those things have happened, it does work. People actually come and tell that then episodes have come. In fact, sometimes the diagnosis of Meniere's is based on patient tells that, sir, I've been taking it for, whenever I take this, I am okay for 1 month, but when I stop it again, it comes like that. So it works, number one. Two is, when it comes to, maybe I am a lazy fellow, when it comes to diuretics, I need to monitor, I need to call them, I need to do some electrolytes once in a while and all those things. Whereas when it comes to beta-histine, I don't really have to monitor. If the person is going to have side effects, he's going to have it in the first week. He will have excessive sleepiness. He will tell, I cannot tolerate this, all those kinds of things. Then I can stop it at that time. But, and once he tolerates it for 1 week, then he'll tolerate it for any long. So for that reason, maybe the choice has become more of that one. Otherwise, if I was not so lazy, probably my first choice would be a diuretic.
Do you think beta-histine is a disease-modifying drug in Meniere's disease?
Sir?
Does it really work to modify the disease? Does it really work on the root level, the root cause?
In the root cause, it depends on like what exactly are we trying to target.
Like beta-histine is more of a symptomatic relief to the patient, or you think that it is going to reverse the disease also?
To some extent, maybe as Suratwala sir has told, during the fluctuating hearing loss stage, maybe it stabilizes. Okay, so that way you can think that to some extent it does modify the disease also, but then it will be outlandish to actually claim that I know for sure that it happens. But one thing, symptomatic relief, it gives very beautiful symptomatic relief.
Okay. Suratwala sir, are you there?
Oh, yeah, Pawan.
Sir.
Can you hear me?
Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Pawan?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sir, one more thing, what we have not spoken about in Meniere's disease is intratympanic dexamethasone. I am sure.
People are asking about that. Dexa and Genta both. When, how much doses, how you schedule that, sir? Suratwala sir.
Yes. No, I really do not favor gentamicin because my basic policy as a doctor remains that if I can't treat the disease, I should not do the harm. That is my basic policy. Okay. Now, gentamicin intratympanically used or intramuscularly or whatever by any other source used, the literature, if you go through, it has caused at least 4% permanent deafness and maximum up to 42%. Okay, there are enough animal studies to substantiate this phenomena of causing the hearsal loss and causing the deafness. So personally, I won't like that my patient says Vatraga is gone, but you have given me the hearing aid.
So Anita, I think if you ask,
okay. So I will always refer the
Anita ma'am is using for long. Anita ma'am.
Who is using?
Yeah. Yes, Pawan. Huh?
Anita.
Anita ma'am can put some more light on intratympanic therapy.
Right. So intratympanic therapy, if you talk about steroids, I think I use it more in my practice for patients with intractable episodes of vertigo which are not responding to medical Meniere's management, but their hearing loss is not so much. So, but often these patients have extreme tinnitus. They have recurrent episodes of vertigo, but the hearing loss is not so much. So there the first line would be an intratympanic, whether methylprednisolone or dexamethasone. And we have seen good results with these, but sometimes if the patient does not respond to the steroids, then gentamicin may be required.
Hello, Anita.
Yes.
Something. The problem is that the dexamethasone, if you see, the results people are not getting about 60 or 70% of the cases. And basically, one must understand what you are trying to do by giving gentamicin. You are doing a destruction of the vestibular system.
Right.
And by dexamethasone, you are restoring the vestibular system. That is the basic difference. Okay.
No, sir,
Now, secondly,
dexamethasone, sir, is not destroying the labyrinthine cells.
that's what I am saying. It is restoring. It is restoring the function.
Restoring. Okay, restoring. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
How it restores is a long topic. If the time permits, sometime I can take the lecture on that. So forget about it. But then, important thing is that you are sharing the very important function, important sense of hearing. That's the one thing. And if you want to push the results beyond 60 or 70%, you need to do the bidimensional. I think Srinivas, you are well aware of the topic, which we did the cochlear, this experimental cochlear hydrops in animals.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am. In fact, that is the first time I saw you presenting on that level of work on the inner ear of mice, your experiment. So I am aware, and the steroid dependency of the inner ear, that was beautiful. I still.
Yeah. So what is the schedule at my place that I use a bidimension approach. Bidimension means one dimension, then you are treating the disease intratympanically with the dexamethasone, and other dimension is that we are giving intravenous steroid, and that is nearly going to the 20 milligram amount, and intratympanic 12 milligram along with the highly relevant injection and Dilocard along with that. Now, before, the thing is that why the failures are there in intratympanic injections, because you are not testing the diffusion capacity through round window. Now, how do we test the diffusion capacity? Whatever the agent you are using, whether gentamicin or dexamethasone or methylprednisolone, you need to inject the Xylocan, say about 0.5 cc. Okay, keep the ear on the dependent position, on the non-dependent position, and then look at the stegmus. If there is a paralytic stegmus is developed, then you are convinced that whatever the agent you are going to inject is going to absorb to the round window. So if it is not going to absorb, naturally you are not going to get the results. Okay, so we take up the next question now.
Sir, one point, sir. One more point. Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Sen has made a point here that he uses beta-histine for acute episode also. Okay. And he finds it to be useful. He wants to know the opinion of the house. That is one thing. One more thing, sir, when it comes to dexamethasone works wonderful for acute episodes. Dexamethasone IV.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. IV dexamethasone can be used for acute episodes, especially if a person has already taken one Stemitil or something, and then you are afraid of repeating it because that may cause extrapyramidal syndromes. At that time, if you give dexamethasone, within half an hour, the patient will sit up and be happy.
Yes, correct. Sometimes my assistant do that in my absence, because he is not allowed to go intratympanic. Okay. Now there is a question from Dr. Pratik. In acute stage, nystagmus beating to affected side. Inactive stage can show no findings. Long-standing disease can show paresis or calorics. Can you comment on this, Srinivas? Probably is talking about the BPPV.
Sir, can you repeat that, sir, again? Acute stage?
In acute stage, nystagmus beating to the affected side.
Okay.
Okay,
so
that is fast beating nystagmus.
Sir, sorry, this is my comment on Meniere's disease. So he can, it's not for BPPV, it's for Meniere's. So Dr. Srinivas, you can go ahead.
Okay, so can you expand this, whatever the Anita has said? In acute stage, nystagmus beating to affected side. In inactive stage, it shows no findings. And long-standing disease can show paresis or caloric. Are there any differential diagnosis apart from Meniere's?
No, again, I don't know, maybe Pratik can just elaborate on what exactly he wanted to ask, sir.
Yeah, I think Anita ma'am has already responded to that. But there is, again and again, they are questioning about the doses and schedule of intratympanic DEXA to Anita ma'am.
Yeah, sorry, Pawan, I was just typing the answer. So, intratympanic dexamethasone, so its role will differ in sudden hearing loss and in Meniere's disease. In sudden hearing loss, we normally give one dose, repeat the audiogram after 4 to 5 days, and if required, if there is some improvement, we may go for the second injection and so on every 4 to 5 days, depending on the audiogram. In Meniere's, we don't usually use the injection so frequently. We go for basically it will be guided by the episodes of vertigo. We normally give it weekly as weekly injections.
So Anita, there's
Yeah.
a question from anonymous. 30 years obese lady on Sabelium 20 milligrams for long term, but mild headache with triggers present. What should we start
Right.
the next medicine?
So I read that question. So if the patient is obese, a young female, flunarizine is not the right drug for her. It would be better to go for topiramate, starting with a dose of 25 milligrams OD in the first week, and then go on to twice a week. The additional you can say beneficial or side effect of topiramate is that it causes weight loss. So it will be quite useful in this patient. So this is how I would treat this patient.
I think, sir, we have overshooted the time. It was up to 9.
Are we short of time, Pawan?
It is already 9. You can invite
So there are a lot of
Amit
there are a
Kesri.
lot of questions still coming. So I request one of the office bearers, maybe Amit or Kshitiz, to answer those questions. If they provide the email, so that you can privately email them and answer those. Pawan, can you take over now?
Yes, sir. Sir, I think we
Yes.
can invite Amit Kesri. Amit, are you there? Amit Kesri?
I will unmute him 1 minute.
Yeah.
No, he's not there.
Oh, it's okay, Prahlad sir. You can.
Please make announcement about next class.
So
next Friday event.
Yeah, Friday we do have. Let me take it out. I'll tell them about the exact things which will be done. So Friday we have a very nice lecture, a very interesting one. I think the most important part of vertigo management, that is vestibular rehabilitation. One and only Dr. Richard Gens.
Wow.
He is going to speak about that. And then Dr. Srinivas Sala would be there to moderate this session.
Okay.
And we have Dr. Rakesh Kumar from AIMS there. And I think 2 more discussions when we can decide over that with the expertise such in the field. So it is going to be one of the most useful and most interesting session on Friday.
And most practical too.
Yes, sir. So I think President can conclude the meeting.
Okay, so thank you all the participants. My special thanks goes to Anita. She has really managed the time and finished the presentation very smartly, timely, and excellently.
And sir, Vivek,
And also I'm thankful. I'm also thankful to Dr. Rana, Dr. Matthews, and of course Srinivas to be there on the expert panel. And also I am thankful greatly on behalf of NES to Dr. Prahlad, and who has really provided all the facilities for transmission and communicating with everybody frequently, promptly, and in the never forget fashion.
And
so
sir,
I hope you will continue the cooperation forever, Dr. Prahlad.
Yes, I'm always available. I'm always available.
Sir, we do have our website, www.nesofindia.com. There they can log in and they will get all the videos, all the recordings of the presentations, as well as they can get a membership form. They can see the forthcoming lectures and all. All the details are there on the website. Please log in there and go to the YouTube channel of NES India.
Okay, I want to make another announcement. Probably, Pawan, we have forgotten. Apart from the membership, that is, NES is starting the temporal bone dissections programs.
Yes, sir.
And there are the two centers are at present available. One is at AIIMS Patna, and Dr. Kranti Bhavna will be taking care of it. And another is at AIIMS Jodhpur, where our past president, dear Amit Goyal, will be taking care of it.
Yes,
the
sir.
official visual display will make it on Friday for that. And those who are interested, they can contact in the details next Friday, so that we can take the necessary action for them and accommodate them for such courses.
Okay, good night, friends. Good night, all of you. Good
Good
night.
night all.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay, good night. So put down the shutters and all the best for the next session.